Hi everyone, Nolan, Bitcoiner. Happy Chinese New Year. I've done my best to include a Chinese character today for Chinese New Year. It's the character for fortune, Fu it's called. So fortune predicts a big Bitcoin boom is what I call today's episode. And what we're trying to do here is really look at some of the prediction models used both in Bitcoin and in financial markets, all over the place. One of the interesting things about horoscopes, when I was first looking at technical analysis in Bitcoin, and we were putting it into the CoinDesk sort of repertoire every day of editorial coverage, CoinDesk at the time had really begun as a technical journal of what's going on in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and scaling debates and the engineering side. And so when the market piece really started, you had some people say, oh, CoinDesk, stop, what are you doing? This is pseudoscience, it's voodoo, what are you doing? And the answer we had was, well, it's horoscopes, right? It's just like horoscopes. It's fun. Come on, people want to read, what's going to happen. Let's see what the tea leaves say and let's go with it, right? So it's a type of horoscopes. Omkar Godboil, the guy who was doing it at the time, still to this day for CoinDesk, who's great at it, is kind of like an international celebrity because he's good at this divination, right? It's a really fun thing. And when I looked at the two of them, though, I said, well, in the end, technical analysis and horoscope divination, which one's really stronger, right? It's hard to say, right? At first, it says we're using math, you're using science, you're using all these practical skills and tools to predict markets. But really, what you have is an observer problem always, right, in technical analysis. So technical analysis never really gets over the problem of who's doing the analysis. Omkar is great. People love him. It's the same way a lot of horoscopes actually work in the real world, right? So we see these horoscope folks giving fortune telling. We see this girl, Marin, she's great, right? She's got a big following now on Bitcoin Twitter and makes all kinds of predictions. What she's using there is the Western version, right? The lines and the angles. One of the interesting things, though, when you start to think about why these things persist and why horoscopes have been able to last for so long, it's because of this observer problem, right? This observer problem, different than TA, and I'll get to that in a minute. The reason why we have these horoscopes in the first place, the reason why there's 12 signs in both the Chinese version and the Western version is because it takes 12 years for Jupiter. It's Jupiter, right? It's a Jupiter thing. It takes 12 years for Jupiter to orbit. And if you're actually going to fix the stars and use them for reference, because Jupiter moves into these different houses, you actually get a complete version of the sky, right? You get a complete version of the sky. In some religions, you see why Saturn, right, the planet Saturn, and then in the mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, why Saturn had such an important role is because Saturn is actually more persistent in the sky than any other night object. Right? That's why it was called the little sun. That's why it's Saturday and Sunday on the weekend, the two big light sources. It was called the little sun because it was light at night. They didn't understand that the sun was actually providing all the light and the reflection in the solar system. They thought there was some source of light at night. No one would believe it was the moon because the moon disappears for days like it has today on Chinese New Year. It's gone. It's a new moon, right? It's totally gone. Jupiter also disappears for times. It's not as reliable. Saturn is the most reliable object in the sky, why it's sort of, second in command in the Western system. So these 12 signs end up giving you this fixed point where you're able to then make references. So what the I Ching does, right? We talked about I Ching last week, and this is where the entire calendar comes from, right? That's why there's 12 characters in both. The calendar, so we have the calendar from it, right? Both calendars are derived from that. It's the year 4719, I think, in the Chinese calendar now, as of today. So I Ching ends up taking this fixed point of the orbit of these different planetary bodies and then adds randomness to it, the I Ching, right? That's the randomness piece. In the case of the zodiac, like what the Western zodiac, like what Marin does, she's taking actually orbital math, right? So different orbit, different specific points. And because there's so many different combinations, you get a version of randomness there. Now, the fixed point plus the randomness has allowed a situation where these predictive models have lasted for thousands of years now. We don't even know when the Western zodiac began. It looks like Cro-Magnon's caveman had actually, in the Alps or in the Pyrenees, actually painted the stars onto those animals, right? Those animals are actually the signs of the zodiac. So we've been following these persistent, reliable beacons in the sky for a long time, using them as fixed points, and then using calculators on top of that to make models and go out into the world and try to understand stuff. So it's what allowed us to move all around the planet and have a common reference, right? Really, in the end, it's the common reference that's so valuable. And so the prediction, I don't see any reason why horoscopes would stop. People seem to be loving them and people follow it and believe in it. And I can't say one way or the other if it's true or not true. That's not really what it's about, right? It's a system that seems to work. It seems to have resisted decay and entropy. And with the fixed point and the randomness seems to be as viable and lively as ever. Now, if we move from there to some other fixed points, right? We can see that, and these are the other elements of the Chinese system. So it's not just the calendar, the earthly elements are also important. And when we look at these earthly elements, earth, air, metal, right? The predictive models formed from them are a little difficult because we don't actually get over the observer problem with any of them. So earth, right? We have this element. So we think of the numeraire now in Wall Street. Here's an interesting fact. With all the money that's been printed, with all of the monetary policy, fiscal policy that's gone on over the past 2 years, you can literally take every single bit of Wall Street research, every forecast, every model, all the work they've ever done, and you can actually throw it in the garbage. It's not worth anything because the number changed, because the numeraire changed 2 years ago and has continued to change. You don't know what you're doing anymore. None of the math makes sense, right? The fixed point was removed, and therefore predictions off of it become a lot more difficult. Let's take air, right? We see climate models a lot, right? In 2015, 2016, I forget the year, fact check it, we finally had satellites that were strong enough to measure more accurately the amount of trees on Earth, right? So you had all these estimates before. When we go into climate models, right? When we go into climate models, we plug in the data and we get a picture of what's going to happen, right? We use these predictive models to understand climate change, right? They probably got a lot right as far as the difference in temperatures of the air, difference in the polar ice caps, difference in melting. I'm not arguing with their observational science, right? What I'm talking about now is the predictive models, How many trees are on Earth is really important for carbon capture. It's really important to know what's happening to the air. So if you underestimate the number of trees on Earth, you got a problem with your model, right? You don't really have a fixed point, right? You don't really know how much air there is. It's kind of hard to measure, right? And if you don't know how many trees there are, you don't know if the air is getting cleaned or not. You don't really have much reference at all. You haven't gotten over the observer problem. You're still stuck there listening to people who are counting trees. Doesn't matter if they have satellites. They got to count the trees to get it right? You can't understand the air otherwise. So just like Wall Street, just like you can take all of the research they've ever done before 2020 and throw it in the garbage, you can take every climate model ever done before that, not the models to understand what we've already done, the damage that's already been done by whatever it is that's happening, right? That they probably got right. I'm not versed enough in climate modeling and science to know what they got right or didn't get right. I think they got it right. But the modeling is where I have my questions, right? How they predicted things in the future. And if you take away or get it wrong how many trees there are on Earth, your models are busted. You got to make a new one, right? You got to just admit that everything you did before is no good and you got to start over. Did that happen? I don't know, right? I don't think it did, right? I think they're still going on some models that were used before with the poorly estimated trees because it's still useful. Metal, right? Metal, that's the other element in the Chinese system. We get money from that for many years, right? But you can actually see the decay and entropy in money in China itself. When the Spanish dollar was the reserve currency of the world before the US dollar, you see these things called Chinese chops, right? They'd gotten so used to fraudulent money that wasn't the right amount of gold in it that they started cutting holes into the money with their names, with their initials, with the Chinese characters. And they would cut holes right into them and they'd pull it out and they'd find out if it was really the amount of metal they had said, right? So historically, we've gone through this problem of decay and entropy in metal and money for many years, right? It's not new to us. You can see it in history. It's been observed many, many times, right? So just like financial models built on literally land, real estate value, all of the things that go into our current financial system, into current Wall Street, doesn't really get over the observer problem at all. Air, climate science, all those models do not get over the observer problem. Metal, you literally needed an observer to cut a hole into the metal to make sure it was still pure, right? You needed that. Now, water, right? So those are 3 elements. Water is another. There's 5 elements. Water is another. Water is an interesting one because what we actually did with water is we created an entire system based on the properties of water. We used water as a fixed point to build the entire metric system, right? So the way we get, for Americans who maybe don't know the metric system where it comes from the properties of water, because if you control all the factors around the water, the temperature, the pressure, all the earthly forces, you get what is observed as a sort of static version of water, right? Water at a certain temperature, then it has certain qualities, the volume, right? That's where you get the basic unit of volume. Temperature, right? The freezing of water became 0. The boiling of water became 100. And then you just divided everything between 0 and 100 and you had water, right? And then you had the metric system because you just shared the common, widely used qualities of water. And now we've got this metric system, which we can use in all kinds of math, and it's quite useful around the world because we've gotten rid of the observer problem. You don't have to tell anyone that, oh, it's actually based on water at this temperature. I don't even know what temperature it's at, right? It's just, I remember that it was done at those qualities, and therefore we get over the observer problem. The next one is fire, right? Fire. Now this is where things get really interesting, right? Fire. So the way to measure that, we actually do have a measurement that comes out of fire. It's joules, right? The heat emitted is joules, right? Joules from the sun at a certain point when we're talking about electricity. Joules are really just the heat that's coming off a system, right? And with those joules, with that energy, we've done something that is pretty unique. We've gotten rid of the observer problem again, just like we did with water for the metric system. There's a fellow named Spencer Nichols, and he had a bit of a tweet thread about this. Now, Spencer seems to be a physicist getting into quantum physics and all that stuff. So I'll try to translate what he says because it's quite complex the way he says it. But he says that Bitcoin is a natural transistor for computing universal value. Given Bitcoin's terminal monetary entropy is 0 and the network rate of adaptation is greater than 0, it means that it's got this quality to get over the observer problem because it's a fixed point, right? Because you're always looking at the previous hash and then adding another, the previous hash actually provides this fixed point for you. He goes on to say that, let me just make sure I find it. So essentially we can observe Bitcoin within its time set without interfering in its order. What is even more fascinating is that Bitcoin is enforcing the liberation of thermodynamic energy at scale via ordering it perfectly in a cryptographically realized stable universe, right? So what he's basically saying is that by getting rid of the observer problem, by solving that observer problem and collapsing everything into this agreed upon shared reality, right? That this thing happened then, as long as enough nodes are watching it, and we know, and we can check that some nodes were watching it at this point, we know that things happened when. And this becomes really resistant to entropy, right? This becomes resistant to all those other problems and removes the observer problem from the situation, right? We now, just like with water, have this agreed upon system that we can extend to all kinds of uses, right? So the metric system was extended all over to be useful, right? I'm pretty sure it's the reason why we made it to the moon, right? I'm pretty sure having a really good unit of account that just moved a decimal here and there in order to understand it, and you can do these calculations really quick in your head, was quite useful in advancing mathematics around the world and getting humanity up to a much more, a time where it's much more capable, right? Much more capable. So what Bitcoin actually offers, right, by focusing on joules and energy, the energy used, right, the actual hash power of the network has stopped any loss of power you can have, and then becomes a really interesting platform on which we can make other predictions and do all those things that we see calendar is useful for, we see the metric system useful for, right? And the things that we could not get out of money before, because the combination of these elements here and the models that came from them never got over the observer problem, right? We're stuck with it. We're stuck with who's measuring how much, what country has how much land, what system does that country have, what legal system, is it good, is it bad, do they have energy there too, how many people, what's the birth rate, right? All that stuff's important for microeconomic decisions for how to, get people to consume something or sell them something. That's not exactly the same as people storing value and storing their savings, right? So air, like I said, it's the same issue, right? We have these climate problems. We don't really have a useful way of predicting what's going to happen. I saw the other day that there's they got to take a bunch of signs off of a glacier in California because it didn't melt according to the predicted scale. It should have melted by now. The sign they put up years ago was like 2022. Everything's going to be gone. Here we are. It's all still there. Not to say that you shouldn't warn people about the effects of what people are doing, but when you get it wrong, you got to check your model again and you got to adapt it. Did that happen? I don't know. I think they took the sign down and just kept using the same models that might have the right amount of trees or might not have the right amount of trees. We don't really know, right? Now, an interesting thing, because it is Chinese New Year, we're going to try and read the Chinese horoscope for Bitcoin, because Bitcoin was born in 2008, 2009, which makes it an Earth rat, apparently. So it's the Earth rat. Now, the way the Chinese system works is you take Earth rat, you take the year you were born, and you apply it to the actual year you're in. So Earth rat will live now in tiger year. So it's the year of the tiger. So the horoscope for Bitcoin, right, for Bitcoin is heralds a mastered year. So I just did this randomly. This is, another one of these random things. I did not scope this out beforehand. I've taken it and I'm reading it here the first time. So the Earth Rat's Chinese horoscope 2022 heralds a mastered year for Chinese zodiac signs born in 1948 and 2008. Despite some conflicting situations and material constraints that can be overcome by showing intelligence and pragmatism, in 2022, the Earth Rat must be able to discreetly withdraw from projects that have become so perilous that they threaten its interest well beyond its initial investment. Without forcing fate too much, the Earth Rat should gain flair where luck is lacking and take into consideration the possibility that commitments made by third parties will not always be kept. Commitments made by third parties will not always be kept. Okay. Any risk of depression and anxiety, but also any excess of enthusiasm, must be detected and channeled wisely. Only a perfect organization of each project will allow the Earth Rat to fall back on its feet with elegance and flexibility. Okay, well, Bitcoin's forecast is kind of on par for what I would imagine for this year, right? We've got to worry about, third parties and stay humble in face of all kinds of changes. So that's my Chinese New Year message. And I think in the end, if this is true, right? If this system is true, that we have in fact solved the observer problem, Bitcoin then becomes the bedrock for an entirely new system of predicting markets, the economy, and all that stuff. And so I think the Chinese New Year does predict a big Bitcoin boom this year.